I could call you Commissioner Sinclair. I could call you Mr. Justice Sinclair. I could call you my lord. I could call you Senator Sinclair. But since I've known you half my life, I'm going to call you Murray.
Well, I could call you lots of things too. But I'll call you Jim.
You call me Jim. So Murray, you've got 5 kids, and you got 3 grandchildren.
Yep.
And you're sitting around
4 grandchildren,
the dinner
actually.
table.
I forgot
You forgot the 4th.
I got 4 grandchildren.
Well, I have none, so I'll be mom. And you're at dinner tonight, and you've got the kids and the grandkids around the table, and you're going to tell them what you heard over the last 24 hours, and you're going to ask them, particularly your grandchildren, how they see Canada's energy future. So tell us about that conversation.
Well, I think what's interesting is probably that I don't need to trigger a conversation with them. It's a conversation that pops up almost all the time because the issue of the environment, the issue of energy is always on their minds. It's in their discussions. They, particularly the older 3, who are 15, 11, and 10, are cognizant through social media as well as media generally about some of the discussion and dialogue that's going on out there. And I have to say they're concerned. They ask me questions when we get a chance to talk about things that I never thought of until I was probably studying law. One of them began with a conversation one night about where do lights come from? Where does the light come from that's in those light bulbs? And when I explained electricity and where electricity comes from and about, in the case of Manitoba, the use of hydroelectric dams and the damming of water, I can remember my granddaughter, who's now 11, being very concerned about what happens to the land when you flood the land. What happens to all the trees and what happens to all the animals that used to live there? What are we doing to them? And so because of our teachings and the fact that our grandchildren and our children have been immersed in the teachings of the indigenous people, the Anishinaabe people, they have a greater sensitivity around that perhaps than many other children their age do. And they're always thinking about it. And so I know that when or if they see that I was part of this conference, they're going to ask me, what did you tell them? And what I want to tell you is that we have to change our relationship with the earth. We have to change the relationship that we have with nature, with the way that we deal with those elements of this creation that are partners with us in life. And I know that my grandchildren will understand that because it's part of our teachings and it's part of what they've grown up with, but not everybody else does. Many of you will have been reading, for example, this week about the conversations that have been held publicly and perhaps in the radio media about a proposal that we should be giving legal status to natural resources, to waters, to mountains, to land. That's I'm not totally opposed to that, but we have to see that as an attempt to use Western methods to give an answer to what is a larger problem. And that is through the use of law and through the use of Western legal concepts. It's similar to giving a corporate entity legal status, for example, as a legal person. But it's not really the solution. The solution is the way we think about the earth and the way we relate to the earth.
What is the right balance between respecting the earth and sharing its bounty?
We know, because there are teachings around the taking of things from the creation, we know that you have to rely upon the earth to provide things to sustain you. So we know, for example, that you have to take the life of an animal in order to feed yourself. We know that you have to take the trees in order to light a fire. We know that you have to use the medicines that are growing on the ground and pick them and use them for purposes of healing yourself. So we have, in our traditions, we have teachings around that, and we have teachings about what you do in order to do that. I had a discussion one time with a representative of one of the oil companies in an airport lounge, which is where I do most of my meetings, incidentally.
Yeah.
But about the question of, what can we do, he said. What can we do better to get some Indigenous support, or to get Indigenous support for what we're doing? And I said, well, one of the first questions I have for you is, what is your ceremony when you take oil from the earth? What is your ceremony when you drill into the ground? Do you have a ceremony? Because the elders would tell you that we need that oil in order to heat our homes. We need that oil in order to propel our machines, and we can take it for that purpose. But we have to do it in a respectful way and in a proper way. And that's why I'm saying that my grandchildren would believe, if they were in charge, they'd make sure that you did the right ceremony before you took the oil, before you took the resource. But they wouldn't say that you can't take the resource. And that's not our teaching. Our teaching is that you can, in fact, you need to take the resource and use it, but you have to do it in a respectful way. You can't assume that you own it. You have to assume that you are partners with it in this creation.
And you don't own it, but you are the stewards, and you have a generational responsibility to pass it on better than you found it.
Our objective always should be for each generation to make it easier for the next generation. So when we realize, for example, and I hope we're all beginning to realize, that we've just come through 150 years of this country's existence. 150 years from now, this country may not be able to rely upon its own resources in order to sustain itself at the rate at which we are now consuming them. Therefore, we really need to think about how we can meet our energy needs without continuing to drain the resources from the earth. And it's just a natural way of thinking. And for our future generations, for our grandchildren and for their grandchildren, we need to be able to give them the means by which they can develop those skills, those abilities, those thoughts, and to plan for how we can develop a better approach to the utilization of those resources to produce energy that will not result in a depletion of the land, depletion of this country, or a dependence by this country upon resources from another place. Because once that begins to happen, and it's beginning to happen, then we will be in a position where we become somebody else's slaves.
You have spent a lot of time and energy traveling coast to coast to coast, talking about reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, and you have set out 94 recommendations that collectively are a call to action. How can the development of our natural resources be an act of reconciliation with Indigenous people?
Well, we have to understand that not everything that we do is a gesture of reconciliation, because and we have to avoid the temptation to make everything about reconciliation. So I give that warning to begin with. Because we have to go about our daily business as best we can and do it in a proper way. And that's part of reconciliation, to change our attitude about things and the way that we behave towards and about each other. But it's also about recognizing that there is some validity to the Indigenous perspective about resources and the land and the earth and the water that needs to be utilized to balance the other perspective, which is that we can just use those things and exploit those things for our own needs and our own benefit. And so it's a question of bringing some balance to the perspective of resources. So there may need to be a department, for example, that is the minister for natural resources and not minister to assist in developing natural resources, but a minister who protects them, a ministry that protects them and challenges everybody's utilization of them, which is part of what your department does now, but it may be that that wall needs to be stronger. So I think that in this day and age, when we are working in a competitive field where we have people who want to move in a particular direction, come hell or high water, so to speak, we need to be sure that there are those proper systems in place, proper checks and balances in place to make sure that it's done in the right way for the right reasons. And so I don't disagree that, and my grandchildren, I know, understand that for their future, they need to be able to live in houses that have electricity, to get around in vehicles that will require energy. But from their perspective, I think they would want to be able to do it in a way that doesn't damage the earth so much.
Canada recognizes the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and contained within that declaration is the concept of free, prior, informed consent.
Yes.
What is your advice to the Government of Canada as it regulates major projects of infrastructure in Canada in order to incorporate what those declarations mean?
Don't be afraid of it. That's my advice. Don't be afraid of it. Most people are afraid of it because they call it a veto power. But, you know, the judiciary, which interprets these things for us, have always said that it's a question of balance, that it's a question of being reasonable, of acting in a reasonable way. And, you know, even provinces that have exclusive jurisdiction in certain areas have to exercise that power in a reasonable manner. If they exercise it in an unreasonable manner, such as to prevent human beings in this country from being able to achieve their full capacity, the ability of the federal government to override that is there. So my advice always is, don't be afraid of it, try to work with it and learn how to work with it, and that's the key. The Indigenous people also need to learn how to work with it. And we haven't had enough of a conversation yet to be able to bring balance to each side for that conversation to be able to move forward. We are using it in one case as a weapon, in the other case as a shield. And we need to learn how to work with it together.
There are some Indigenous leaders who say, yes, it's very good to have a conversation about energy and about partnership, but we live in dreadful conditions in our home communities. We don't have houses for our people. How can you have a conversation about how to light them if people aren't secure? How do we establish our priorities on the way in which we can make a difference?
We have to have a plan to begin with. So we have to have an overall vision about where we want this country to be at each successive generation point going forward. So what is that plan? And how does the question of meeting the immediate needs and urgent needs of the most impoverished people in this country, the most isolated people in this country who have been impoverished and isolated because of past government and society's actions, how do we move forward while still addressing it? That's the key. We have to address it, but we also have to move forward. And so we need a plan that includes addressing those urgent needs, but also gets us to whatever the ultimate vision is.
When you say that we need a plan, I want you to tell us more about who is we. There is a national government, there are provincial governments, there are self-governing Indigenous communities, there are those that aren't. So give us a little more idea of the we.
This generation is not capable of doing that yet. We're the ones that have contributed to the problem. What we in this generation need to do is to facilitate the conversation for the next generation, so that the generation after that is the one that puts this together. So when you start having grandchildren, then my grandchildren and your grandchildren will be able to have that conversation. But right now, we need to be the ones who start to develop the framework of that vision. And we can do that. We have the capacity. Look at these people. We have brilliant people in this room. We heard from one of the most brilliant international voices on the issue of international energy utilization, talking to us about the importance of this conversation. We need to have these conversations in these kinds of places all the time, on a regular, ongoing basis, because these conversations are important. And these conversations will bring balance for the next generation. And the next generation after that will be the ones, when they're sitting here, they'll be saying, we're sure glad those old people back in 2017 started us on this path.
Let's say that we're both fortunate that we have the right DNA. We're going to be back up 20 years from now, Murray, you and I, and we're going to be talking about how great we used to be. And we're
Well,
also,
I will anyway. But.
yeah, and we're also going to reflect on how things have changed since we had that memorable conversation together. What do you think we'll be saying to each other?
Well, we have a fundamental conversation that has to occur around the question of how Indigenous and non-Indigenous people talk to and about each other. That changes first and foremost in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report is a foundational conversation, because that's about racism. That's about not only individual racism in terms of how people think about each other, but it's about systemic racism as well. It's about how we've built systems that need to be altered, need to recognize that they have built in means by which Indigenous people are denied access to the same kinds of opportunities that non-Indigenous children are not. But that conversation needs to occur, and needs to occur soon, and I see it going on. I see it going on because education is the key to that, and our educational system is beginning to address that. And so the children of the people in this room are being educated differently than I was educated and you were educated when we went to the public schools of this country. And that's a good thing. But down the road, I can see that when our grandchildren are having a conversation about what it is that they want to do for the future, that conversation will be about how we can continue to meet our energy needs in a way that does not harm the environment any more than it's already being harmed, because we won't be able to live if the environment refuses to let us.
You and I had a conversation in your office as you were preparing the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I asked you if you had to prioritize the first dollar that you would spend to enhance aspirational goals of Indigenous people. You told me that the first dollar you would spend would be on Indigenous languages.
Yes.
Why did you say that?
Because part of the balance that needs to be brought back to the relationship is that the time and energy that this society, through the actions primarily of its government, but also its major institutions like the churches, have been to damage culture and language, to take away language. And it's through the restoration of language, the utilization of Indigenous languages, that Indigenous children will be able to understand their culture and themselves better, because it's in the language that so much history is contained. But it's also about, first of all, before we can have a relationship of mutual respect, we need to understand the importance of bringing self-respect to Indigenous youth. And that will be the most significant process of self-respect that we can do, and that is to bring their languages back to them. Because they always talk about those languages as my language. And they wanted.
Are you hopeful?
I'm always hopeful. I am. Amazingly, despite what everybody else tells me not to be, I am very hopeful. I think it's all going to happen.
And you inspire hope in all of us. Monica.